Owen Hale set 2 sealed-colored twine spools on the tailgate beside 3 loose bales. Even though the custom Baler operator standing across from him insisted the real problem was still Owen's Windrows. Rain clouds were building beyond the west fence. That gave Mark Hale less patience for arguments than usual. "These are unopened," Owen said, turning one spool so the factory seal faces father. "We weigh one before it goes in. We count every bale. We weigh what's left when we stop." Carl, the custom operator, folded his arms. "You can weigh twine all afternoon. A baler uses what it needs. Those windrows get heavy in spots. You'll use more." Paul Hale glanced across the field Owen had raked that morning. The rows looked straight from where they stood, but Paul had already heard Carl's explanation twice. "Carl's been baling longer than you've been driving," Paul said. Owen did not answer. That was one reason Mark had agreed to the test. Not because Owen had won the argument, because he had finally stopped arguing. The invoice clipped to Mark's truck visor showed twine charges well above what the family expected, and several bales from the earlier run had loosened or broken while being moved. Owen had raked that hay. Carl said uneven windrows had forced the baler to make inconsistent bales and consume extra twine. Owen thought the explanation did not fit what he had seen. But the first time he tried to prove it, he had made a mistake. He had pulled a partly used spool from the baler, counted what remained, compared it with the number of bales in the field, and told Mark the numbers were wrong. Carl had asked one question. How much twine was on that spool when we started? Owen had not known. The spool was already open. It had been mixed with another partial spool during the job. Nobody had recorded its starting weight. His argument collapsed in seconds. Now Owen lifted one of the sealed spools from the tailgate. Mark stopped him before he walked toward the baler. "Everybody understands what this proves and what it doesn't." Owen nodded. One short run, marked windrow, known spool, bale count. And nobody touches that knotter while the machine is operating. Carl nodded. Owen did too. Any inspection would happen only after shutdown. Mark looked toward the darkening sky. "I'm authorizing one witness test. That's it. We still have hay down. And I'm not losing a dry window to settle somebody's pride." That landed harder on Owen than Paul's doubt. The hay belonged to Mark. So did the claim against the custom baling bill. Owen could collect records and make his case. But he could not stop the entire job or decide what the family would pay. If this test wasted time without producing useful evidence, Mark could end it. Owen carried the spool to the scale on the tailgate. Paul watched the reading. Mark wrote it down himself. Owen then walked to the test strip and checked 2 stakes marking a nearly uniform section of windrow. He had avoided the turn where the rake had double material. That was the first useful thing his fail count had taught him. He could not test everything at once. If the windrow changed sharply, Carl could blame the windrow. If the spool had already been used, nobody knew the starting point. If nobody witnessed the numbers, the argument could begin again afterward. This time Owen was trying to remove uncertainty before the baler moved. Carl climbed into the tractor. The engine started. Owen stepped well clear as Mark signaled that the test could begin. The baler entered the marked windrow. One bale formed. Then another. Owen watched the finished bales, not the moving knotter. The first dropped tight. The second did too. By the time Carl reached the far stake, several clean bales sat behind it with their twine, holding firmly. Paul pressed a boot against the nearest one. It stayed tight. For the first time that afternoon, he said nothing. Owen felt hope rise and immediately distrusted it. A few good bales did not explain the earlier excess. They only created a harder question. If Owen's windrows could produce normal, securely tied bales under controlled conditions, what had changed during the run that produced the invoice, the loose bales, and all that missing twine? Before Carl moved again, Owen and Paul counted the finished bales twice. Mark checked the number against his own notes. The open colored spool was removed and weighed again. The result was ordinary. Not dramatic enough to prove everything. Just ordinary enough to matter. The spool had lost about what they expected for the number of securely tied bales. Carl leaned against the tractor tire. There, machine's fine. Owen looked at the bales. That proves this run was fine. Carl's expression tightened. Paul glanced at Owen, as if deciding whether that answer was careful or stubborn. Owen knew the difference mattered. A week earlier, he might have pointed at the clean bales and declared himself right. Now, he had one control result and a much larger unexplained loss behind it. He pulled a folded sheet from his pocket. That morning he had gone back through the field records and marked where the earlier problem bales had come from. He could not reconstruct every foot of the original run, but the pattern bothered him. The worst failures were not clustered only where the windrows were heavier. Some had come from sections he remembered raking evenly. He showed Mark the notes. I'm not saying every windrow was identical. They weren't. But if heavy spots caused all the extra twine, the failures should follow those spots. Mark studied the page. Do they? Not cleanly. Carl shook his head. A field isn't a laboratory. No, Owen said. That's why I need comparisons we can trust. He walked toward two more windrows raked in the same pass. Owen had marked their ends and noted where one narrowed slightly around a low patch. He planned to use only the most consistent sections. His system was simple now. Known twine at the start. Clearly defined hay. Bale count. Known twine at the finish. Tie failures recorded separately. And somebody besides Owen watching the numbers. That last part had become as important as the scale. His first failed attempt taught him that evidence collected alone could become another argument. Mark could say he trusted Owen. Carl could say he trusted his machine. Neither statement told them where the twine had gone. Owen set the second sealed spool beside the scale, but did not open it. 2 sealed spools were all he had bought, enough for controlled comparisons, not enough to waste carelessly. Beyond the field, the western sky had darkened. The weather radio in Mark's pickup had already mentioned rain, moving through overnight. The family did not have unlimited time to experiment. Dry hay was lying ready. Every hour spent testing was an hour not spent finishing the field. Carl pointed toward the clouds. You want this hay baled, we ought to bale. Mark looked at Owen. That was the real deadline. Not the invoice. Not the argument. The hay. Owen felt the pressure shift. A controlled test could protect him from a false charge. Too much testing could cost him the crop anyway. We don't need to test the whole field, Owen said. We need enough to know whether twine use changes while the windrows stay comparable. Paul looked toward the clean bales. What else are you tracking? Ties and failures. That's all. If I track 10 things, we'll argue about 10 things. Paul almost smiled. Owen had already learned what happened when he tried to make weak evidence stronger by piling estimates on top of it. They ran another marked section. Again, Owen stayed clear and watched the finished bales fall. Each held. At the end, Mark signaled to stop. They repeated the count and weighing. Again, the numbers looked normal. Carl climbed down after shutdown. You have your answer. Owen wished he were right. 2 clean short runs meant the Baler could work normally. They did not prove it had worked normally before, and they did not guarantee it would continue working normally during hours of full field operation. Mark folded Owen's record sheet. We have dry hay in a machine that just made good bales twice. That was not a verdict. It was a decision point. Was there enough evidence to stop the custom baler now? No. Was there enough reason to watch it carefully? Yes. Carl looked toward the remaining acreage. I can get most of this finished before the rain if we quit stopping every few minutes. Mark handed the sheet back to Owen. Then we move forward. You keep the records. Carl keeps bailing. We don't burn the weather window, chasing a problem we can't reproduce. Owen nodded. It was a reasonable decision. That was what made him uneasy. The control tests had removed the easiest explanation. The Windrows had stayed uniform. The twine use had stayed normal. The bales had stayed tight. Somewhere between those clean runs and the earlier failed job was a condition they had not captured. Carl restarted the baler and moved toward the larger field. For a while, nothing happened. The Windrows fed smoothly. The bales dropped tight. Owen began to wonder whether the original excess had come from some combination they would never reconstruct. Perhaps one section had been heavier than he remembered. Perhaps several small differences had accumulated. Perhaps the invoice was high but not wrong. Then one bale dropped with a loose strand trailing from its side. Owen straightened. Paul saw it too. 1. Owen wrote it down. The next 2 bales looked normal. Then another came out with extra twine gathered unevenly along one edge. Carl kept moving. Owen checked the windrow. Its width had not changed enough to explain what he was seeing. He marked the location. A few minutes later, the problem disappeared again. That was worse than a constant failure. A constant fault could be isolated. An intermittent one could hide inside normal operation and make every argument uncertain. When Carl reached the end of the pass, Mark signaled for a stop. Only after shutdown did Owen approach the finished bales. Most were tight. 2 were not. One showed more twine than the neighboring bales. Carl walked over. That spot was heavier. Owen looked back at the windrow. Not enough to account for this. You can't eyeball density. No, that's why I marked the section. Carl exhaled. You keep looking for the machine to be wrong. Owen shook his head. I'm looking for something repeatable. That was his real correction. Not merely buying better twine. Not merely adding a scale. The correction was refusing to treat one result as proof just because he liked it. The sealed spool test showed the baler could operate normally. This longer pass showed something could change even while the windrow remained comparable. Neither result canceled the other. Together, they suggested an intermittent condition. Mark picked up Owen's notebook. What do you know? The first count was useless because we didn't know what was on the spool at the start. Mark nodded. The sealed tests. Normal use. Good ties. And these failures? Something changed during the run. I don't know what yet. Paul glanced toward Carl. That doesn't prove your windrows aren't part of it. No, Owen said. Then he pointed toward the marked section. But it gives us a place to compare. Owen returned to the tailgate and looked at the second sealed colored spool. Still unopened. That mattered now. They had clean reference runs from known twine. They still had another sealed spool available if the problem appeared badly enough to justify a decisive comparison. Owen wanted to use it immediately. He stopped himself. The field was dry now. The rain was getting closer. Using their last clean control too early might leave them with nothing when the dispute mattered most. Mark reached the same conclusion. We keep that one sealed. Owen nodded. Carl looked relieved. Then let me finish. Mark studied the sky, then the hay. All right. Before Carl entered the main field, Owen asked for one final witness pass on a marked section. Not because the baler had failed again, because it had not. He wanted one clean reference recorded in front of everyone before, whether pressure forced him from testing into full commitment. Mark looked west. You get one pass. They used the same kind of uniform section they had already checked. Owen recorded the start weight. Paul checked the bale counter. Carl ran the marked windrow. The bales dropped tight. At the end, the count and finish weight again showed normal twine use. Carl gave a short laugh. That's what I've been telling you. Owen looked at him. For this run. Mark spoke before the argument could restart. This is the run we controlled. Paul pressed against one finished bale, then another. Both held. So the Windrows can go through that machine without causing a problem. Carl pointed toward the larger field. On a short run. Owen nodded. That's all we proved. Paul studied him. You really aren't going to claim more than that? No, but I'm not going to claim less either. That changed something. Not enough to settle the invoice. Not enough to explain the earlier failures. But enough that Mark no longer treated Owen's concern as a defensive excuse from the person who had raked the hay. The controlled runs had separated one accusation from one fact. Uniform Windrows could produce normal twine use and secure bales through Carl's machine. Whatever caused the earlier excess had not appeared during those tests. Mark looked at the clouds. The pressure now came from the field. The hay was ready. The machine was available. The controlled runs had succeeded. Stopping because of a problem they could not reproduce would risk leaving good hay exposed to rain. Carl knew it. We keep moving now. I can finish most of this. Mark looked at Owen. Owen understood the choice. He could demand more testing and spend the dry window proving something that might never happen again. Or they could trust the best evidence they had. There's no reason to stop it now, Owen said. Keep the second spool sealed. I'll keep records. Carl started toward the tractor. Owen added one condition. If the failures come back, we mark where they happen before anybody blames the Windrows. Carl looked back. You planning to follow me all afternoon? I'm planning to know what changed. Mark raised a hand. That's enough. We bail. Before walking away, Paul glanced at the type test bales. I was sure your raking was part of it. Owen closed a notebook. It still could be part of something. Paul shook his head. No, I was sure before we checked. It was the first reversal Owen had earned. Then Carl engaged a baler and entered the main field. For the first hour, the full field run looked like a vindication of the decision to continue. Bales dropped tight. Owen recorded past locations and checked finish rows for loose ties or broken corners. Nothing obvious changed. Paul began moving completed bales toward the collection area. Mark stopped watching every pass and turned to other work that had to be finished before rain. That was how confidence returned. One normal bale at a time. Owen felt it too. He had spent so much effort trying to prove something was wrong that part of him now wanted the machine to fail again just so the records would make sense. He hated that thought. This was Mark's hay. A clean finish mattered more than winning an argument. So when another long stretch came through without trouble, Owen wrote it exactly as he wrote the failures. Normal ties. No breakage. Comparable windrow. Then, halfway through the next pass, one bale dropped with a loose loop hanging from its side. The next looked tight. Then another came out with extra twine across the face. Paul saw it from the wagon. There's another one. Owen marked the location. Carl continued. A third bale held together long enough to leave the chamber, then loosened as it settled. Now the pattern was changing. Good bales and bad bales were coming from the same stretch of field. The hay thickness varied slightly, as every real field did, but there was no sharp change where the failures appeared. Carl reached the end and stopped. After shutdown, Owen examined the results. One loose bale carried more twine than the tight bale beside it. Carl climbed down. That windrow loaded uneven. Owen pointed back across the pass. Then why are the good bales mixed between the bad ones? Because the baler corrects for some of it. Then the windrow isn't enough to explain the failures. Carl's jaw tightened. You gonna teach me how my machine works? No, I'm saying the result doesn't follow the field condition cleanly. Mark arrived. How many failures? Owen gave him the count. Enough to slow collection if it keeps going. Carl looked at the sky. And stopping us will slow it more. That was true. Mark had to choose between two risks. Keep bailing with an intermittent problem they had not isolated, or stop a mostly functioning machine while dry hay remained exposed. How much is holding? Mark asked. Most of it, Owen said. Carl spread his hands. There's your answer. It was not an answer Owen liked, but it was a defensible operating decision. Most of the bales were sound. The rain was closer. Mark nodded toward the tractor. Keep moving. Owen marked every failure. The pace increased. That was when the margin began to disappear. A loose bale had to be handled differently from a tight one. A broken bale cost even more time. Each failure forced Paul and Mark to slow collection, separate damaged material, or leave a bale temporarily where it lay. Carl kept producing. For a while, the field filled faster than the family could clear it. Owen's notebook changed from occasional marks to a pattern. Good bale. Good bale. Failure. Good bale. Excess twine. Good bale. Loose tie. The Windrows remained comparable enough that the old explanation looked weaker with every pass. But Owen still lacked the one thing he needed to settle the dispute: a controlled measurement while the fault was actually occurring. The second sealed spool remained unopened in the truck. Owen looked toward it twice. Both times he stopped himself. Using it meant interrupting production, unloading the current spool, weighing, resetting the comparison, and losing more of the dry window. Mark had already chosen continued bailing because most of the output remained usable. Owen could not turn every suspicion into a shutdown. Then a bale near the center of the field broke open during collection. Hay spilled from its loosened shape and had to be gathered again. Paul climbed down from the wagon. This is getting worse. Carl, shut down at the end of the pass. Owen checked his notes. The failure rate had risen. Not enough to stop the field cold. Enough to consume time they no longer had. Mark looked west. The sky had gone from warning to deadline. We finished what we safely can before the rain. The first rain did not fall hard enough to ruin the entire field. It only made every delay more expensive. A cold sprinkle crossed the western edge, while Paul and Mark were still collecting the last tight bales from the far side. Then the rain thickened. Not a disaster. Just enough moisture to stop pretending all the hay would remain in the condition it had been in that afternoon. The broken and loosened bales suffered first. Some had been left where they failed because handling them safely took longer than moving sound bales. Others had spilled enough hay that the family had to gather and separate it rather than stack it with a dry load. Owen stood beside one open bale, while rain darkened the loose hay along its top. That image hurt more than the invoice. The invoice could be argued. This could not. They had lost time recovering failed bales. That lost time had put part of the hay under rain, and the machine had produced enough good bales between failures that stopping earlier had never been an easy decision. Mark pulled the truck closer to the shed. Get the records inside. Owen gathered his notebook, the field sheet, and the unopened sealed spool. Carl parked the baler. No one touched the knotter. Any inspection would happen only after full shutdown and under proper supervision. By the next morning, the dispute had changed. It was no longer only about excess twine. Now there were loose bales, rehandling time, rain exposure, and disputed custom baling charges. Dana reviewed the billing with Mark. Owen sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open while Mark listened. Dana's position was simple. The control tests had shown the baler could tie normally. Carl maintained that inconsistent field conditions had contributed to the later trouble. The family had continued operating after some failures became visible. Without a decisive control test during the fault, responsibility could reasonably be shared. Dana offered a partial credit. Mark repeated the offer after the call. It was enough to make the dispute go away. Not enough to answer what had happened. Paul leaned against the counter. "Take it." Owen looked at him. "I'm not saying Carl was right," Paul said. "I'm saying you got some credit, and we still have Hay to deal with." Mark said nothing. The settlement authority was his. Owen understood that. He also understood why Dana's offer was reasonable from her position. Their evidence was incomplete. The sealed spool runs had been normal. The full field run had developed intermittent failures. Their records showed the failures did not neatly follow obvious changes in Windrows, but they had never measured twine consumption with a sealed spool while the fault was actually happening. That missing link was the entire case. Owen looked at the unopened spool on the table. "We shouldn't accept shared fault without testing the shared fault claim." Paul frowned. "You want to run that machine again?" "Under a witness test." "That's still the same machine. Then we control the conditions." Mark finally spoke. "What are you asking for?" Owen slid the notebook across the table. "Matched Windrows. 1 sealed spool. Start weight witnessed. Known bale count. Finish weight witnessed. And if it starts failing, we stop the run." Paul pointed toward the equipment yard. "And then what? You crawl into the knotter?" "No." Owen answered immediately. "Nothing gets inspected while it's running. Full shutdown. Adult supervision. Then the knotter gets checked." Mark studied him. Owen felt the old version of himself trying to push forward. The version that wanted to say he already knew the answer. He stopped himself. "I'm not asking you to decide I'm right. I'm asking whether we can make the answer visible." Mark leaned back. "What if the run is normal again? Then the machine passes that test. And the settlement?" "That's your decision." Mark nodded slowly. The answer mattered. Owen was not claiming authority. He did not have. That afternoon, Owen and Mark walked the remaining dry hay and selected comparable stretches raked in the same pattern. They avoided rain-disturbed sections and marked clear boundaries. Owen did not search for perfect hay. Perfect conditions would make the test less useful. He wanted field conditions similar enough that the result could be compared honestly. Dana agreed to review 1 witness run before closing the billing dispute. Carl agreed to operate it. Mark would supervise. Paul would witness the bale count. The sealed spool would be weighed before installation and after the run. No one would inspect moving parts. If the fault appeared, they would record the result, shut the machine down safely, and only then inspect the knotter. Owen placed a sealed colored spool on the tailgate beside the scale. For days he had treated it like proof. Now he understood better. It was not proof. It was only a control. The proof would come for what happened when everything else stayed comparable. Mark broke the seal. He watched the starting weight. Paul checked it against the number Owen wrote in the notebook. Carl stood nearby with his arms crossed. The selected Windrows had already been marked and compared. They were not identical, but they were close enough that no one objected to using them for the test. Mark looked at Carl. "You understand the limits?" Carl nodded. 1 witness run. We stop at the failures show. And no inspection until full shutdown. "I know." Mark turned to Owen. "You record. You do not operate the machine." Owen nodded. The roles were clear. Mark controlled the test. Carl operated the baler. Paul witnessed the count. Owen tracked the evidence. The colored spool went into the baler. Everyone stepped clear. Carl started. For the first few bales, nothing unusual happened. The first dropped tight. Then another. Then another. Owen recorded each one. The uncertainty that followed him for days began creeping back. What if the machine behaved perfectly again? Another tight bale dropped. Paul called a count. Owen wrote it. Then the next bale came out with extra twine, riding unevenly across one side. Owen looked up. Paul had already seen it. One bad. Carl kept moving through the marked section. The following bale looked normal. Then another came out with a loose tie. Owen marked the location. The windrow had not suddenly doubled. Nothing obvious had changed in the hay. A third failure appeared before the end of the test section. Mark raised his hand. Carl cleared the machine, then stopped. The equipment shut down. Nobody approached until Mark gave permission. The failed bales mattered, but they were only half the test. Paul and Owen counted every bale produced during the marked run. Mark checked the number. Then the remaining colored spool was removed and returned to the same scale. Paul watched. Carl watched. Mark watched. Owen wrote the finished weight. For a moment, no one spoke. He calculated the difference once. Then again. He compared it with the bale count and the earlier control runs. The loss was too high. Not a rounding problem. Not a small variation. The sealed spool had surrendered substantially more twine per bale during the run, where the failures appeared than during the normal control runs. Carl stepped closer. Those bales weren't all the same. Owen pointed toward the marked field section. No, but the windrows stayed within the conditions we agreed on before the run. Carl looked at Mark. This still isn't a laboratory. Mark answered before Owen could. No, it's the field where we were told the windrows caused the charges. That stopped the argument. The matched windrows had remained comparable. The failure pattern had returned. The sealed spool had lost excess twine at the same time. The problem Owen had failed to capture earlier was now visible in one control sequence. But one question remained. Why? Mark waited until the baler was fully secured for inspection. Only then did the adults begin checking the knotter area. Owen stayed back. He did not reach into the mechanism. He did not try to become the technician. The test had already done his part. The inspection only needed to explain the physical result. Under safe shutdown conditions, where became visible around the feeding action. When the mechanism was checked manually under supervision, the fault showed itself. The knotter could misfeed and pull more twine than intended before completing a tie, intermittently. Exactly the kind of fault that could hide through several normal bales and then appear again without a major change in the windrow. Paul looked from the knotter to the loose bale beside the test strip. So it could work fine, then start wasting twine again. Mark nodded. That's what the run showed. Carl's face had changed. He was no longer arguing about Owen's raking. He looked at the machine. I didn't think the knotter was doing that. Owen did not answer with "I told you so." He had not known either. He had only known the blame did not fit the evidence. That distinction mattered. Mark called Dana with the witness results. He gave her the start weight, the finish weight, the bale count, the failures, the matched windrow conditions, and the shutdown inspection finding. Dana asked questions. Mark answered them. Owen sat nearby with a notebook, open in case Mark needed a figure repeated. When Mark ended the call, Paul spoke first. Well, Mark looked at Owen. The excess twine charge is coming off. Owen said nothing. The disputed failure-related charges are being reversed too. Dana is also crediting the documented hay loss tied to the delay. Paul exhaled. Carl looked toward the baler. Mark was not finished. That knotter stays out of service until it's repaired and the machine is checked. Carl nodded. There was no dramatic confession. No sabotage. Carl had believed his experience. He had trusted a machine that sometimes worked perfectly, and when failures appeared, he had blamed the most visible variable in front of him, Owen's Windrows. Paul walked over. "I was wrong about your raking." Owen closed a notebook. "The first test I did was bad." Paul shook his head. "That doesn't make me less wrong." It was the apology Owen had wanted days earlier. Now it felt smaller than he expected, because the important thing was sitting on the tailgate, the colored spool, its broken seal, its measured loss, evidence that did not ask anyone to trust Owen's confidence. Mark picked it up. "One thing still bothers me." Owen looked at him. "We've proven the machine failed during this run." Mark glanced toward the remaining hay. "But before I call this completely finished, I want to see what it does after the repair." Owen understood. The bad run had exposed the fault. A normal repaired run would close the last material question. Not whether Owen had been blamed unfairly. That verdict was already clear. The question was whether correcting the knotter would return the baler to normal twine use and tight bales. The repaired baler returned after the knotter work was completed and checked. Owen did not treat that as the end of the story. The charges had already been reversed. The rain loss had already been credited. Carl's claim about Owen's Windrows had already failed under the witness test. But a repair should change something visible. Otherwise, they had only found worn parts and assumed they were the cause. The remaining suitable hay gave them one last real-world confirmation. Mark set the rules. No extended experiment. No argument. They would record the same things they already understood. Comparable windrows. Bale count. Tie failures. Twine use. Then they would let the results speak. Owen stood near the field edge with a notebook he had carried through the dispute. The early pages embarrassed him now. Partly used spool. Unknown starting quantity. Estimates beside estimates. He had thought being analytical meant collecting more numbers. The field had taught him something harder. Bad numbers did not become good evidence because there were many of them. Carl started the repaired baler. The first bale dropped. Tight. Owen made one mark. The second held. Then the third. Carl continued down the windrow. Paul moved among the completed bales and checked them as they came. No loose loops. No broken ties. No strange accumulation of extra twine. The machine sounded ordinary. After days of watching every bale as if it might reveal a secret, ordinary was exactly what they needed. At the end of the first long pass, Carl stopped. Owen counted. Paul verified. The twine use matched the pattern from the earlier normal control runs. Mark looked at the finished row. Again. They ran another comparable section. The result held. Tight bales. Normal twine consumption. No repeating failure pattern. No delay from broken bales. By midday, the last material question had its answer. The repaired knotter changed the outcome. The same kind of windrows that had been blamed before were now moving through machine without abnormal twine loss or tie failures. Owen closed the notebook. He did not feel triumphant. He felt finished. Dana completed the billing correction. The excess twine charges remained removed. The disputed failure-related charges were reversed. The documented loss connected to delay and rain exposure was credited as agreed. Nothing about the settlement replaced damaged hay. It only put the cost where the evidence said it belonged. Carl's machine remained subject to the repair and operating checks required before normal custom work resumed. He did not lose his livelihood. He did lose the assumption that experience alone settled the disagreement when the record said otherwise. Paul found Owen near the shed as they stacked the last sound bales. "I owe you something better than what I said yesterday." Owen looked at him. Paul nodded toward the field. I blamed your Windrows before we had proof. Carl said it, and it sounded reasonable, so I went with it. Owen shrugged. My first proof was bad. That still doesn't make the blame fair. Owen looked down at the notebook. No. Paul smiled slightly. You gonna frame that thing? The notebook? The spool? Owen laughed for the first time in days. Mark had saved the colored test spool. It sat on the workbench beside the final records. Later that evening, Mark called Owen over. I've been thinking about the next time we hire custom work. Owen waited. Mark tapped the notebook. You'll handle verification. Owen looked up. Mark continued before he could misunderstand. Supervised. I still own the contracts. I still settle the bills. I know. But you check the starting conditions. Counts. Materials when they matter. Anything we agree should be witnessed. Owen nodded slowly. It was not control of the farm. It was not authority over Carl or Dana. It was something more specific. Responsibility Mark had not trusted him with before. You sure? Mark looked toward the stacked hay. You were careless with the first test. Owen almost smiled. I remember. And then you admitted it was bad instead of defending it. Mark picked up the notebook. That's why I'm sure. The next morning, Owen walked past the workbench before starting chores. The colored spool from the decisive test was still there. Its seal was broken now. Beside it, Mark had set one of the final bales from the repaired run. The bale sat square and tight. The twine lay clean around it. Days earlier, a sealed spool had been Owen's attempt to prove everyone else wrong. Now it meant something different. Measure before accusing. Control what you can. Admit what you cannot prove. And when the evidence finally holds, let it carry the weight.